welcome to the Leading with Lean podcast. My name's Philip Holt, author of Leading with Lean, The Simplicity of Lean, and Leading Lean by Living Lean. And in this podcast, I narrate all three of my books, chapter by chapter, in which I share with you my over 30 years of experience as a lean leader across many companies globally. Leading with Lean, Chapter 8, Discipline as a Competitive Advantage. The simplicity of discipline. Jim Rohn once said that discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. I think that this statement has a certain elegance in explaining the simplicity that discipline can bring. We all want to accomplish our goals, but it is a truism that those who reach them are the ones who have been prepared to put in the effort needed, which requires discipline. To illustrate this point, last year I wrote an article about a problem-solving review that reminded me of the childhood nursery rhyme about the old woman who swallowed the fly. In the article, I reminded the reader that, whilst we still don't know why she swallowed that fly, we do know that it created a chain of events leading to the ingestion of a horse, which according to the nursery rhyme, was less than conducive to her good health. The reason that I was prompted to use this metaphor was that the problem-solving process that I was reviewing had made the common mistake of not getting to the root cause and instead taking countermeasures against the symptoms. The result was that the team had accepted that a workaround to the correct process, caused by a lack of discipline in the original process, was a legitimate process in its own right. They had therefore tried to find the root cause of the failure of that process. The resulting countermeasures increased the complexity of a process that should not have existed in the first place. If only the root cause of the lack of adherence to the standard process had been addressed. Despite my best efforts, I could not prevent the explanation in the paragraph above from being complicated. So you can imagine what the actual process looked like and how challenging it must have been to work with while ensuring quality. This was, once again, a great proof point of the simplicity that discipline brings and the complexity created by not having the will to ensure that discipline. Another elegant statement, for which I do not know the author, is discipline is just choosing between what you want now and what you want the most. The reason that I like this statement is that I feel that it articulates well why we struggle with discipline so much in organisations, particularly in larger ones where people are perhaps detached from the consequence of a lack of discipline. Either it will not fall to them to resolve it, or it will take so long to become a consequence that it's not a concern to them at the time when they have to make the decision. What generally happens is that the person making the decision on which action to take will often know what the correct action is in terms of the standard process. This was the case in the example above, in which the decision to ignore the required approach at the beginning of the process was because it was easier, in the short term, not to follow it. For the people making the decision, there were little to no consequences, and, even where there could have been, they were literally weeks if not months away. The effort to follow the process to the standard and to problem solve where there were issues with the standard was therefore more than the majority of the people were willing to invest. The fact of the matter is, most organisations is that discipline to process and standards is often seen as a negative, both in terms of stifling the creativity of the individual and in restricting the flexibility of an organisation. However, time after time I see evidence that those organisations which pride themselves on the flexibility within the processes are often simply covering the cracks of failure in earlier steps of the process and expend a lot of time, energy and resources in doing so. Furthermore, the flexibility that they are so proud of is not benefiting the customer, but is instead assisting colleagues who have been let down as a result of a process failing due to a lack of discipline. The result is that the organisation is not flexible, nor do the individuals have any time to be creative. More significantly, the customer does not benefit one iota from this so-called flexibility. Additionally, as in the earlier example, additional processes and sub-processes are often created to work around the correct processes with unofficial SOPs, standard operating procedures, creation of work instructions and different parts of the organisation working in their own ways, which seems to make sense to them. The worst part is that these are very often processes that are rework loops and add no value to the customer. And to compound this, process improvement initiatives automate the process with IT or robotic solutions to make it more efficient. However, as Drucker once so poignantly said, there is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. Just like the old woman who tried to solve the problem of a swallowed fly through the addition of other animals further up the food chain, many organisations spend a considerable amount of time adding processes without adding value in an attempt to solve the problems in their existing processes. By getting to the true root causes of the issues, putting in place countermeasures, and applying discipline around the execution of the process standards, the organisation can deliver high performance, better flexibility due to shorter lead times, and free up the time of its employees to be creative. The reality is that the lack of discipline creates significant complexity, whereas discipline provides simplicity in an organisation, something which most greatly need. Discipline as an advantage. As mentioned earlier, focusing on discipline is often seen in a negative light, a way of controlling people and limiting both personality and creativity. However, in my view, the critical factor is whether the focus is on driving discipline in processes or in applying discipline to people. For example, consider the ineffectiveness of a large proportion of meetings where it's not uncommon for people to arrive late and unprepared, and for a significant proportion of the meeting to be unproductive, making it ineffective overall. If we try to solve this problem with increased discipline for our people, we are unlikely to make any long-term improvement, as we will encounter both passive and active resistance when we tell people how to behave. However, if we take countermeasures to the root causes of underperformance, focusing on reducing the inhibitors and increasing the promoters of effective meetings, we take a process approach to engendering discipline and will engage our people in improving the meeting processes. This may be a nuanced difference, but in reality, it will result in the creation of a standardised, effective meeting culture in the organisation, driven by the people who make it work. As retired Lieutenant General Frank Kearney said, disciplined processes create agile organisations. The most agile organisations are those who have a high degree of discipline, which essentially means that they have standardised what they already know how to do well and then stuck to it. This has allowed them to spend their time focusing on solving the problems, taking the opportunities, that is, that they don't yet know how to solve. In his book Focus, Daniel Goleman describes how repeatedly practicing something with discipline allows the brain to move it from the top part, requiring focus and high cognitive energy, to the bottom part, allowing distinctive operation at low cognitive energy. This is essentially unconscious competence and can be achieved in an organisation when we standardise our processes, align them with the current best way of performing the task, and then ensure that we have effectively trained everyone who will be working with them. Hi, Philip here. Sorry to interrupt the narration of this particular chapter, but I just wanted to remind you that all of my personal profits from the books go to charity. So if you would like to buy a book, it would really be helpful. Otherwise, if you feel that the podcast is sufficient, then please feel free to make a donation to my current charity, which is Women's Aid. It's a great charity which helps to stop domestic violence for women and children. Thank you. When we do this, we free up people's cognitive energy to be spent on other things, those activities that will grow the business and improve customer service and operational performance. Athletes and sports players are a great example of this. Goleman's book gives the example of those great quarterbacks, American football, who are credited with being able to see the field. What they are actually able to do is the result of their thousands of hours of practice, which repays them with an ability to use the low cognitive energy part of the brain. This is true in all areas of life where we want to perform at the top end of the spectrum, be it in American football, golf, marketing, public speaking, painting, or ballet. Whatever we want to be good at, we must standardise and have the discipline to continuously practice that standard. Bringing this back to business, it's therefore essential that we set up our processes in a standardised way and act with the discipline required. Only when we do this will we allow ourselves the time to adequately focus on making the breakthroughs in performance necessary to be the best at what we do. The challenge is that most of us spend our time in perpetual firefighting, and some organisations actually promote people on their competence as a firefighter, therefore reinforcing this culture within the organisation. Ironically, working in a culture where firefighting activity is the norm will mean that our people will become highly skilled at it and will become conditioned to it as the standard way of working. What we therefore need to do is break the habit of firefighting and start to celebrate and recognise those people who use disciplined, standardised approaches to problem solving and upholding process rigour to prevent problems recurring and free up the time to improve the business. To paraphrase Albert Einstein, managers firefight problems, leaders prevent them. To do this requires us all to behave differently and for the leadership to take up the challenge to drive the transformation that is required in the business. This takes individual and organisational stamina and a change leadership approach that is consistent and long-term in its thinking. However, what is most important is the mindset that we develop towards operational excellence. We would never expect to see an athlete or a musician performing at the top of their chosen profession without thousands of hours of practice over many years. So why do we expect to take shortcuts in developing our businesses to be world class without putting in the disciplined practice that it takes? We somehow seem to expect that there are formulaic approaches that can be applied and bought in to shortcut the years of practice required to become excellent in the areas that business needs to be excellent in. This doesn't mean that we cannot learn from others and transform faster than others have done before, but it does mean that we cannot abbreviate the process to the extent that most businesses attempt to do, and we must invest the time to consistently execute on the transformation plan. At this point, I think that it's important to clarify that this standardised and disciplined approach to business processes does not mean that we won't improve them or that we don't make step changes when necessary. We must also create a culture of continuous improvement, a Kaizen culture that delivers multiple, small, everyday improvements leading to large improvements over time. Combining this with policy deployment, or Hoshinkanri, we will make the step change improvements that are required where continuous improvement won't suffice. Once again, we can use the sports world as a metaphor with the example of Tiger Woods. When he had reached the limits of success that he could master with his tried and tested golf swing, he controversially decided to transform it. He effectively moved his golf swing out of the bottom part of his brain up to the top part and reprogrammed it. Slowly but surely, through hours of practice, his swing moved into the bottom part. This was a step change improvement that continuous improvement couldn't have brought him. We therefore must realise in business that transformation takes time and thus set the right balance between continuous improvement and step change activity, realising that in both cases, the ability of the organisation to maintain discipline over the long term is going to make the difference between success and failure. This is where discipline becomes a competitive advantage. I see dead people. In the movie The Sixth Sense, starring Bruce Willis, the twist of the story is that the child that he's talking to can actually see ghosts, and that Will's character, Dr. Malcolm Crowe, is one of those unfortunate souls. This is a surprise to Dr. Crowe and not something that he is happy to discover, bringing the sudden realisation that his life will never be the same again. While it's certainly not as significant as discovering that they are ghosts, when a lean leader learns to identify the multitude of waste that exists within an organisation's value streams due to a lack of discipline, it's nevertheless a life-changing event. As the more that they learn to see the waste and lack of discipline that is tolerated, the more difficult it is for them to moderate those observations. At a certain point, everywhere they go and every process that they see contains activity that simply does not add value for the customer, but is accepted as the way that we do things here. The challenge for the lean leader becomes the coaching of colleagues to see the waste themselves rather than delivering the often unwelcome bad news to them. This is where the lean leader must be smart and ensure that they do not gain a reputation as someone who is negative or unrealistic, even naive about the way that things need to be done. Instead, they should coach problem solving, asking the right questions to ensure that the waste and the lack of discipline inherent in its cause is identified by those who do the work themselves. Obviously, not all waste is caused by a lack of adherence to a standard, but I've come to believe very strongly that before we set off down the route of re-engineering or reinventing our processes, we must in the first instance ensure that we're running to standard and observe the performance running as the process was designed. When we do this, we often discover that quite a number of the problems that we are encountering are caused by simply not adhering to the current standard, and that the reinforcement of this, with the requisite training and communication to reinstate it, will provide a significant uplift in performance. This SDCA, Standardise, Do, Check, Act, before PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act approach, is actually the basis for continuous improvement, but it is often overlooked and is an excellent way in which the lean leader can help to demonstrate to the organisation the value of disciplined execution to standard, followed by problem solving, ultimately leading to Kaizen where necessary. In the book now, you would see a visual of standards enabling continuous improvement where it shows the PDCA and SDA cycles running up the performance curve against time, with Kaizen a key element of that move from one standard to the next. Leading discipline. The lean leader has significant task in most organisations if they are to support the move toward disciplined execution. However, this chapter has hopefully demonstrated the value that can be derived through a focus on developing your organisation's disciplined adherence to processes, not by focusing directly on the discipline of the people, but on the adherence to the processes. As mentioned earlier, this might sound like nuance, but as with most things in life, nuance can be the difference between collaboration and conflict, and so it's important that this subtlety is embraced. Think about the number of Kaizen events and projects that could be circumvented if running to standards solve the majority of the problems in a particular process. This doesn't mean that you will ignore that process, as we will still want to continuously improve, but we can deprioritise it and focus on those processes that truly don't run well when we run them to standard. This is when we can make fact-based decisions on our priorities. Think of it like being in an extremely cold house during the winter and realising that heat is being lost through the doors and the windows which are not secured. The processes that are not currently running to standard can be thought of as the doors and the windows which have simply been left open and need to be closed, whilst the processes that are running to standard but don't work are broken panes which need to be repaired. Somewhere in between, there will be doors and windows that have insufficient insulation and need to be improved. In this metaphor, I'm sure that the prioritization of tasks would be pretty straightforward, and it's important that we get this level of clarity with our business processes.